In 1928, the Appalachian mining town of Prosperity Creek and its 117 inhabitants were erased from the map. For 80 years, the world believed it was a tragic act of God. But in 2008, a deep Earth survey would unearth the town, perfectly preserved, and reveal a truth far more sinister than a simple mine collapse. It wasn't a tragedy, it was a tomb, meticulously engineered to bury a terrible secret, along with the men, women, and children who called the valley home. The autumn of 1928 found Prosperity Creek simmering with a tension as thick as the coal dust that coated every surface. Nestled in a remote West Virginia hollow, the town was not a community but a property, owned entirely by the formidable Blackwood Coal and Iron Company. Every home, the single general store, and even the small wooden church belonged to Silas Blackwood. He owned the land, the jobs, and, in his mind, the very lives of the people who toiled in his mines. Life in the hollow was a paradox of natural beauty and industrial brutality. The surrounding hills blazed with the colors of fall, but the air carried the perpetual scent of soot and sulfur. The creek that gave the town its hopeful name ran dark with slurry from the mine. The people of Prosperity Creek were isolated, trapped by the steep valley walls and the single company-controlled road that led to the outside world. It was a kingdom built on coal, ruled by an iron fist. At the heart of this kingdom was Silas Blackwood, a man forged from the same unyielding rock his miners chiseled from the earth. He was not a resident but an owner, viewing the town from the distant comfort of his city mansion. To him, the miners were not men with families and dreams. They were components in a vast machine of profit. Their loyalty was expected, their compliance was demanded, and their dissent was a malfunction to be corrected with absolute authority. His will was enforced by a private security force, a cadre of grim-faced men who patrolled the town's borders. These were not local lawmen but company guards, loyal only to the man who signed their paychecks. They were a constant, visible reminder of where the true power lay in Prosperity Creek. Their presence ensured that every grumble of discontent was noted, every whisper of rebellion was heard, and every challenge to Blackwood's authority was swiftly and silently addressed before it could take root. Into this oppressive atmosphere stepped Elias Thorne. He was not an outsider, but a son of the mines, a man whose hands were as calloused as any other. Yet he possessed a fire that Blackwood could not extinguish, a belief in justice. As a union organizer, Thorne gave voice to the miners' silent desperation, channeling their fear and frustration into a unified demand for safer conditions and a wage that was more than a glorified allowance at the company store. Thorne was a charismatic and persuasive leader, respected by the miners because he stood with them, not above them. He spoke of dignity, of the right to work without the constant fear of a cave-in, and of the right to provide for one's family without being shackled by debt to the company. His words were a spark in the dark tunnels, igniting a hope that had long been dormant in the hearts of the people of Prosperity Creek, a dangerous flame in Blackwood's tightly controlled domain. The strike began in early October. It was a desperate, final stand. The miners laid down their tools, demanding negotiations for safer tunnels, fair scales for weighing their coal, and an end to the company store's predatory credit system. They were not asking for riches, only for a chance at a life free from the constant shadow of death and debt. For them, it was a fight for survival. For Silas Blackwood, it was an act of open insurrection that could not be tolerated. Blackwood's response was immediate and merciless. He refused to negotiate. Instead, he brought in a new wave of strike breakers, hardened men from out of state with a reputation for violence. The company store, the town's only source of food and supplies, cut off all credit. Families who had worked for Blackwood for generations suddenly found themselves on the verge of starvation, their loyalty repaid with calculated cruelty. The hollow was effectively under siege, a prison of its own geography. the tension escalated with each passing day. The armed guards became more aggressive, their patrols a constant source of intimidation. The air grew thick with a palpable sense of dread, a feeling that the standoff was careening toward a violent conclusion. The miners held firm, their resolve strengthened by Elias Thorne's leadership, but they were isolated and outmatched. They were a small island of defiance in an ocean of corporate power, and the tide was turning against them with terrifying speed. On the final night of Prosperity Creek's existence, a surprising message arrived from the mine office. Silas Blackwood, who had been in town overseeing the strike, summoned Elias Thorne for a final negotiation. The news spread through the small, clapboard houses with a mixture of cautious optimism and deep suspicion. Could the iron-willed owner finally be ready to bargain, or was this merely another move in his ruthless game? Thorne knew the risks, but understood he had no choice but to go. As Thorne made the lonely walk to the mine office, the rest of the town gathered in the small church at the center of the hollow. It was meant to be a solidarity meeting, a chance to bolster their spirits and pray for a peaceful resolution. Men, women, and children huddled together in the wooden pews, their faces illuminated by the soft glow of kerosene lamps. They sang hymns, their voices rising in a fragile chorus of hope against the encroaching darkness, unaware of the fate being decided for them. They were a community bound by shared hardship, united in their struggle for a better future. Inside the church, they found strength in each other, a collective will to endure, whatever came next. They were families who had celebrated births, mourned deaths, and shared what little they had within those simple walls. That night they gathered one last time, a flock seeking sanctuary, while the wolf waited patiently just outside the door, ready to enact his final, terrible solution. From that night the official story was born, a narrative carved in stone and repeated for decades. The Blackwood Coal and Iron Report cited a massive spontaneous methane explosion deep within the primary mine shaft. The blast, they claimed, was of such a catastrophic magnitude that it fatally compromised the geological stability of the entire valley. It was a freak occurrence, an unpredictable and devastating act of nature that no one could have possibly foreseen or prevented. The report described how the explosion triggered a colossal landslide. Millions of tons of rock, earth, and timber cascaded down the steep mountainside in a matter of minutes, a relentless avalanche of destruction. The entire town of Prosperity Creek, with its 117 souls, was buried under 100 feet of debris. There were no survivors. The valley that had once held a community became a mass grave, sealed by the very mountain that had provided its livelihood. For 80 years, this version of events was accepted as tragic fact. The site became a solemn memorial, a place where descendants would come to mourn the ancestors they never knew, lost to the unforgiving power of the earth. Textbooks recorded it as one of the worst mining-related disasters in the state's history. The story of Prosperity Creek became a cautionary tale, a somber legend of a town swallowed whole in a single terrible night. The company, led by Silas Blackwood, expressed its profound sorrow, establishing a charitable fund for the families of the victims. Blackwood himself was portrayed as a grieving patriarch who had lost a significant part of his workforce and his legacy. He had built the town, and in a cruel twist of fate, nature had taken it away. The narrative was perfect, clean, tragic, and, most importantly, final. It absolved the company of any and all responsibility. No formal investigation was ever conducted beyond the company's internal report. The sheer scale of the landslide made any attempt at recovery or forensic analysis impossible at the time. The evidence, along with the bodies, was buried too deep. The state, heavily influenced by the power of the coal industry, officially accepted Blackwood's findings. The case of Prosperity Creek was closed, its truth sealed beneath a mountain of rock and lies. The memory of the town faded, kept alive only in the sorrowful folklore of the region and in the hearts of families like the Thorns, who lost their great-grandfather Elias that night. His name was listed among the dead, just another victim of the supposed accident. The open wound of his loss and the loss of an entire community was left to scar over with time the questions of that final night, buried along with the town itself. The children and grandchildren of the victims grew up with this story. They learned of the brave miners and their families, all tragically lost in a single moment. They were told it was an act of God, a phrase that offered a sense of cosmic finality, but little real comfort. The story provided an ending. But for those who knew the tensions of 1928, it was an ending that never felt entirely complete, a chapter that seemed to be missing its most crucial pages. The world moved on. New mines were opened, and old ones were closed. The Blackwood Corporation grew into a modern energy conglomerate, its foundation built on the profits from mines like the one that now lay dormant beneath the memorial site. The story of Prosperity Creek became a footnote in a long history of industrial progress, a sad but necessary price paid for the nation's insatiable hunger for energy. The silence of the valley was absolute. Over the decades, the landscape healed itself. Trees and dense undergrowth covered the massive landslide, softening its harsh, craggy features. Nature reclaimed the valley, hiding the scar on the earth. To an outside observer, it was just another beautiful, uninhabited Appalachian hollow, holding no sign of the vibrant community that once existed there, or the violent end it had met. The tomb had become a forest, its secrets protected by a verdant shroud. The official narrative was a masterpiece of deception, so effective that it endured for generations. It was a story that protected a powerful man's legacy and a corporation's reputation, built on the graves of those who had dared to challenge them. The truth of that night in October 1928 was a ghost, a silent specter, waiting patiently for the earth to be disturbed once more, for the story to finally be told. And so, for 80 years, the official account stood unchallenged, a monument of words as solid as the mountain itself. It was the only story the world knew. But what really transpired in the final desperate hours before the landslide? Who benefited from the silence of 117 souls, and what secrets were deemed so dangerous they had to be buried under an entire mountain? The year is 2008. 80 years of silence had passed over the valley where Prosperity Creek once stood. The land, now under the stewardship of Blackwood Energy, the modern, diversified successor to Blackwood Coal and Iron, was slated for a new geological survey. The company sought to map potential natural gas reserves locked deep within the Appalachian Shale. It was a routine operation, a matter of corporate due diligence, employing advanced deep earth resonance testing to chart the subterranean world. The irony was lost on the technicians, who saw only rock strata and potential profit margins, entirely unaware they were probing the lid of a forgotten coffin. The technology was a marvel of modern science. A specialized truck sent powerful, low-frequency sonic pulses deep into the earth. The returning echoes were captured by a grid of sensitive geophones, creating a three-dimensional map of the geology miles below. For days, the data painted a predictable picture of sedimentary rock, coal seams, and dense granite. The team was mapping the bones of the mountain, charting its hidden architecture. They were looking for a future source of energy, completely oblivious to the static preserved energy of a past tragedy that lay just beneath the surface. Then the readings changed. The system detected a massive, inexplicable void, a cavity hundreds of feet below the surface that did not conform to any natural geological formation. It was too large, too uniform. Before the team could fully analyze the anomaly, the mountain groaned. The sonic pulses, vibrating at a precise frequency for 80 years, had found a fatal harmonic. They had disturbed a delicate, unnatural equilibrium, shaking loose the keystone of a structure that was never meant to last forever. The ground shuddered, not with the violence of an earthquake, but with the deep hollow sigh of a collapsing tomb. A vast section of the forested mountainside gave way, sinking inward with a sound like tearing thunder. Trees, soil, and 80 years of overgrowth slid into a newly formed chasm, exposing something that defied all logic. As the dust settled, the survey team stared into the abyss from a newly sheared cliff edge. Below them, nestled in the earth like a ship in a bottle, was a town. Not ruins, not rubble, but whole buildings, a church steeple, the rooftops of houses, the unmistakable outline of a main street, all impossibly preserved in the anaerobic darkness. Prosperity Creek had returned to the world of the living. News of the discovery sent a shockwave through the state's historical and archaeological communities. At the forefront was Dr. Eris Thorne, a respected historical archivist at West Virginia University. For Eris, Prosperity Creek was not just a historical footnote, it was a deep, personal wound. Her great-grandfather was Elias Thorne, the Union organizer whose name was etched onto the memorial as just another victim of the tragic landslide. She had dedicated her academic career to preserving the stories of these mining communities, driven by a familial ghost she had never known. The state, recognizing her unique expertise, immediately requested her presence on site. Arriving at the chasm, Eris felt a profound sense of temporal vertigo. The place she had only known through faded photographs and sorrowful family legends was now physically present, exhumed from its grave. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and something else, something ancient and still. Below her, the town was a tableau of interrupted life, a perfect snapshot of an October evening in 1928. It was an archivist's dream and a descendant's nightmare, a place where history had been stopped with the force of a slammed door. She was there to catalog a tragedy, not knowing she was about to uncover a conspiracy. The initial descent into the unearthed town was surreal. The lack of oxygen and the constant temperature below ground had created a near-perfect state of preservation. Homes stood intact, their clapboard siding faded but whole. Inside one, a dinner table was set for a family of 4, plates of fossilized food still in place. In another, a rocking chair sat beside a fireplace, a book lying open on a small side table. It was a ghost town in the most literal sense, every detail a silent testament to the moment time had stopped. The official narrative of a sudden violent landslide seemed to be confirmed by this eerie stillness. The initial teams moved with reverence, treating the entire town as a fragile archaeological treasure. They documented everything from the prices listed on a chalkboard in the general store to a child's forgotten doll lying on a porch swing. The scene was one of profound melancholy, a community caught unawares by the wrath of nature. Eris walked the silent streets, feeling the weight of her great-grandfather's presence, imagining his final hours in this doomed place. Every preserved detail seemed to underscore the randomness of the disaster, a story of humanity's futile struggle against the immense power of the earth. The first hint that something was profoundly wrong came from the church. It was the town's largest structure, and it was where the recovery teams focused their initial efforts, expecting to find the largest concentration of victims. They pried open the heavy oak doors and stepped into a scene of absolute, ordered horror. The townspeople were indeed there, men, women, and children filling the wooden pews. But they were not crushed by falling beams or buried in debris. They were sitting and lying in strangely composed positions, untouched by the landslide that had supposedly killed them. A veteran forensic anthropologist was the first to voice the unthinkable. As he examined the initial bodies, he noted the complete absence of the injuries associated with a structural collapse or landslide. No massive blunt force trauma, no signs of crushing, no evidence of asphyxiation from dust or gas. The bodies were eerily intact, preserved by the same conditions that had saved the buildings. The cause of death was not the mountain. It was something else entirely, something far more deliberate and far less natural. The atmosphere of solemn tragedy began to curdle into one of chilling suspicion. The preliminary forensic reports were delivered to the on-site command post, and their contents shattered 80 years of accepted history. The cause of death for nearly every one of the 117 inhabitants of Prosperity Creek was not the landslide. It was a single, devastatingly uniform event: gunshot wounds. The analysis revealed that the bullets were from high-powered rifles and sidearms of a type issued to professional security forces of the era, not the hunting shotguns or small-caliber pistols a miner might own for personal protection. The pattern was unmistakable and horrifying. This was not a tragic accident. It was a systematic execution. The people of Prosperity Creek had been murdered before the mountain ever fell. The landslide, the act of God that had defined the town's legacy, was not the cause of death. It was the cover-up. It was a tombstone, meticulously engineered and violently placed upon a mass grave to hide an atrocity. The official report from 1928, the story repeated for generations, was a complete and monstrous fabrication. For Dr. Eris Thorne, the revelation was a physical blow. The academic detachment she had fought to maintain crumbled, replaced by a cold, searing rage. Her great-grandfather had not died in a random industrial disaster. He had been murdered along with every man, woman, and child who had stood with him. The family legend of a heroic leader lost to tragedy was replaced by the brutal reality of an assassinated dissident. Her role shifted in an instant. She was no longer just a historian cataloging the past. She was now the primary witness in an 80-year-old mass murder case. The site was immediately sealed under the authority of the state police. Yellow crime scene tape, a jarring slash of modern color against the monochrome palette of 1928, was stretched across the entrance to the hollow. What began as a geological survey had become a historical recovery and had now escalated into one of the largest and oldest homicide investigations in American history. The case of Prosperity Creek, long closed and consigned to the pages of history books, was officially reopened with a single, horrifying word: massacre. The news was carefully managed, but whispers of the truth began to leak out, shaking the foundations of West Virginia's political and corporate landscape. The Blackwood Energy Corporation, led by the philanthropic and publicly revered Julian Blackwood, grandson of Silas, issued a statement expressing their shock and pledging full cooperation. They offered condolences for the newly discovered disturbing aspects of their company's history, positioning themselves as fellow victims of a long-buried truth. It was a masterful public relations move, designed to insulate them from the sins of the past. Eris watched Julian Blackwood's televised statement from a small trailer at the edge of the crime scene. She saw not a shocked philanthropist, but the guardian of a dark legacy, a man whose fortune was built upon a foundation of blood and lies. She knew that the resistance to her search for the truth would not come from the earth, but from the powerful men who still benefited from the silence of the dead. Her quest for historical clarity had become a direct confrontation with a dynasty. The state assigned a veteran cold case detective to lead the official investigation, but everyone understood that Dr. Eris Thorne was its heart. Her intimate knowledge of the town, its people, and the labor struggles of the era made her indispensable. She held the context, the motive, the narrative that the cold, hard forensic evidence lacked. The detective had a crime scene, but Eris Thorne held the key to the story. She would be the voice for the 117 souls who had been silenced so brutally. Her mission was now clear and absolute. She had to dismantle the official lie piece by piece and reconstruct the events of that final, terrible night. She needed to find the evidence that would not only prove what happened, but would unequivocally identify who was responsible. The world now knew that Prosperity Creek was a mass murder. But the identity of the monster who gave the order remained a ghost, protected by 80 years of wealth, power, and calculated deception. The investigation would begin within the preserved town itself, a perfectly frozen moment of time. Every house, every ledger in the company store, every scattered document in the mine office was a potential clue. The town was not just a grave, it was a time capsule, holding the secrets of its own demise. Aris knew the answers were there, waiting in the silent buildings, hidden within the fabric of a community that had been violently erased from the map. The challenge was immense. Evidence was 80 years old. The perpetrators were likely long dead. A powerful corporation stood in the way, its modern reputation at stake. But for Aris, the passage of time meant nothing. Justice did not have an expiration date. For her great-grandfather, and for the 116 other victims, the fight that began with a strike for dignity in 1928 would now be finished with a search for truth in 2008. She stood at the precipice, looking down at the exhumed town as the sun began to set, casting long shadows that looked like grasping fingers. The discovery of the bodies was the inciting incident, the undeniable proof of a crime. It had rewritten the first chapter of the story, transforming it from a tale of tragedy to a tale of terror. The world was finally asking the right question, not what happened to Prosperity Creek, but who did this to them? The scale of the crime was staggering, almost incomprehensible. How could a corporation murder an entire town and hide it from the world? Who had the power, the resources, and the sheer ruthlessness to engineer a landslide as a murder weapon? The questions swirled in the chilling air, each one more daunting than the last. Aris Thorne felt the immense weight of her task, a burden of history and blood she had to carry. She knew the path forward would be treacherous, obstructed by a legacy of power designed to bury this exact truth forever. The Blackwood name was synonymous with progress and philanthropy in the state, a reputation built over decades. To challenge it was to challenge the very history of the region. Yet the truth was there, in the preserved homes and the silent church, waiting to be given a voice. The initial shock of the discovery was now giving way to a grim determination. The forensic reports had provided the how, but the why was still locked in the past. Aris understood that to solve this crime, she would have to reconstruct the final days of Prosperity Creek, to understand the desperation of the miners and the cold calculus of the man who owned them. The answer was not just in the evidence, but in the story. The state police began their methodical grid search of the town, treating every preserved object as a piece of a puzzle. The work would be slow and painstaking, a delicate process of archaeology and criminology combined. Each item had to be cataloged, analyzed, and placed within the context of the town's final hours. It was a race against time, as exposure to the modern atmosphere would begin the slow process of decay that the mountain had prevented for so long. Aris Thorne turned away from the chasm and walked back toward the command post. The first phase was over. The body had been found. Now, the autopsy had to begin. She felt a deep, cold certainty in her heart that the key to everything, the irrefutable proof that would bring down an empire, was still down there, hidden in plain sight, waiting for someone to finally look in the right place. The unearthed town was a testament to a colossal crime, a monument to corporate brutality. The silence of the valley had been broken, and the ghosts of Prosperity Creek were beginning to speak. Their first words had exposed a lie that had stood for nearly a century, transforming a local legend of tragedy into a national story of an almost unimaginable massacre. The investigation was in its infancy, a single flickering candle against 80 years of darkness. The forensic evidence had confirmed the crime, but it could not name the architect. That would require a different kind of discovery, a piece of the past that had survived not only the landslide, but the subsequent decades of silence. The truth of what happened in the mine office on that final night was the real missing piece. The scale of the cover-up was as breathtaking as the crime itself. To bury a town required more than just explosives. It required absolute power, the complicity of individuals, and the silence of institutions. The investigation would not just be about finding a killer. It would be about exposing a system that allowed him to get away with it. The roots of this crime ran deep into the very soil of the state. Eris felt the weight of the 117 souls, their story now resting in her hands. She was their descendant, their archivist, and now their avenger. The world saw an unearthed town, a historical marvel. She saw a crime scene, the final desperate act of a community that had dared to ask for a better life and had been sentenced to death for it. The first layer of deception had been peeled back, revealing the horrifying truth of the murders. The investigation began under the cold, sterile glare of generator-powered floodlights that cast the unearthed town in an unnatural, ghostly glow. State Detective Miles Corbin, a man whose career was built on sifting through the cold ashes of forgotten crimes, officially led the inquiry. Yet everyone on site understood the investigation's true heart was Dr. Eris Thorne. Corbin had the authority and the methodology, but Eris possessed the context, the history, and a burning ancestral right to the truth. She moved through the silent streets, not as an academic, but as a ghost hunter, searching for the echoes of a crime that had been silenced for 80 years. Her mission was to give a voice to the 117 souls whose last moments were preserved in this subterranean tomb, starting with the man whose blood ran in her own veins. Julian Blackwood arrived on the third day, descending from a sleek corporate helicopter that seemed an alien intrusion upon the rustic stillness of the hollow. He was the picture of refined grace and solemnity, his silver hair and impeccably tailored suit a stark contrast to the mud-caked boots of the investigators. Publicly, he pledged the full, transparent cooperation of Blackwood Energy, framing the discovery as a shared tragedy that finally allowed a dark chapter of his family's history to be understood. He spoke of honoring the dead, of providing closure, and of his grandfather, Silas, as a flawed but ultimately tragic figure, himself a victim of the era's brutal industrial realities. It was a masterful performance of compassionate control. Behind the cameras, however, Blackwood's cooperation was a carefully constructed maze of legal obstacles. His corporate attorneys descended upon the site, filing injunctions to preserve the historical integrity of Blackwood property, which effectively slowed forensic access to critical areas like the mine office. They demanded oversight on all evidence handling and subtly questioned Eris Thorne's objectivity, citing her familial connection to Elias Thorne as a conflict of interest. Julian Blackwood was not facilitating the investigation. He was attempting to manage it, to contain the narrative just as his grandfather had contained the town itself. His every move was calculated to protect a legacy built on a monstrous secret. The investigative team's first priority was to systematically deconstruct the crime scene within the church. Forensic specialists, working with painstaking slowness in the fragile environment, mapped every shell casing and bullet trajectory. The results painted a chilling picture not of a chaotic firefight, but of a disciplined, methodical execution. The shooters had moved with terrifying efficiency through the pews, firing from controlled positions. Ballistics analysis confirmed the ammunition was from 30 .06 Springfield rifles and .45 caliber sidearms, standard issue for professional security forces and mine guards of that period, not the assorted hunting rifles the miners would have owned. The massacre was carried out by a trained force acting on a clear and unified command. Eris's role was to provide the human context for the cold data. While the forensic team analyzed the physical evidence, She began the arduous process of identifying the victims, cross-referencing their positions in the church with Old Town census records and family photographs she had spent her career archiving. She identified entire families huddled together in the pews, mothers shielding their children in their final moments. This was not the indiscriminate violence of a riot. It was the deliberate eradication of a community. The question became starkly clear. Who possessed the authority and the sheer ruthlessness to order the systematic slaughter of 117 men, women, and children in their place of worship? The focus then shifted to the official cause of the town's burial, the landslide. A team of geologists and demolition experts were brought in to analyze the rock strata of the chasm walls. Using modern seismic imaging and core sampling, they uncovered what the 1928 Blackwood Report had so carefully omitted. They found the distinct chemical residue of dynamite, not in one location, but in a series of precisely drilled boreholes at the narrowest, most structurally vulnerable point of the valley. The blast patterns were inconsistent with a single accidental methane explosion deep within the mine. Instead, they indicated a coordinated surface-level detonation designed for one purpose: to bring the mountain down. This discovery was the first definitive scientific nail in the coffin of the official narrative. The landslide was no act of God. It was an act of engineering. The Blackwood Coal and Iron Report of 1928 was not just a misinterpretation of a tragedy, it was a deliberate, foundational lie. Detective Corbin laid the geological survey maps next to the original company report in the command tent, the two documents representing two irreconcilable realities. One was a story crafted to protect the guilty, the other a truth written in the very rock of the earth. Julian Blackwood's carefully constructed facade of a shared, unfortunate history began to show its first significant cracks. When confronted with the new geological findings, Julian Blackwood expressed practice to disbelief. In a televised interview, he suggested that any explosives were likely part of the mine's standard operations and that their detonation during the methane explosion was a tragic coincidence. He painted his grandfather, Silas, as a man who would have relied on the expert opinions of his engineers, suggesting they were the ones who may have misinterpreted the event. He was skillfully shifting potential blame onto long-dead, nameless employees, attempting to insulate the Blackwood name from the now undeniable fact that the landslide was artificially triggered. But his explanation was thin, a desperate attempt to patch a story that was rapidly falling apart. While Blackwood managed the public narrative, Aris turned her attention to the most valuable resource preserved in the town, its documents. The anaerobic environment had kept paper records in a state of remarkable preservation. In the general store, she found ledgers detailing the company's predatory credit system, showing how every family was systematically kept in a state of perpetual debt. These were not just financial records. They were records of control, a clear motive for the miners' desperation. The strike was not about greed. It was a fight for economic freedom against a system designed to enslave them, a system Silas Blackwood had perfected. The next breakthrough came from the mine's payroll office. Buried under a stack of routine wage disbursements, Aris discovered a separate off-book ledger. It detailed cash payments made in the 2 weeks leading up to the disaster. The payments were for 20 security consultants, men whose names appeared nowhere on the official company roster. Their rates were exorbitant, far exceeding those of the regular company guards. More chillingly, the ledger noted a final substantial bonus payment to each man, dated the day after the town was buried. Why would a company issue massive bonuses to a temporary security force immediately following a catastrophic accident that killed its entire workforce? Simultaneously, the ballistics team made a crucial connection. They cross-referenced the manufacturers of the 30 Zorro-6 rifles used in the church massacre with procurement records from the era. They discovered that the Baldwin Felts Detective Agency, a notorious and violent firm of private agents, frequently hired for Union-busting activities, had purchased a large batch of rifles with sequential serial numbers just 1 month before the Prosperity Creek disaster. While the rifles themselves were not recovered, the shell casings were a near-perfect match for the ammunition specifically issued by that agency. The 20 security consultants on the secret ledger were not guards. They were a death squad. Eris felt the pieces locking into place, forming a picture of cold corporate calculus. Silas Blackwood, faced with a strike that threatened his absolute authority and profit margins, had not hired strikebreakers to intimidate his workers. He had hired professional assassins to eliminate them. The final negotiation with her great-grandfather, Elias Thorne, was never meant to be a negotiation. It was the lure to draw the leader away, the opening move in a meticulously planned slaughter. The gathering at the church was not a coincidence, it was a convenience, corralling the entire population into a single, indefensible location for maximum efficiency. The weight of this reconstructed timeline was immense. Eris stood in the preserved mine office, the secret ledger open on the desk, and imagined the final hours. She envisioned Silas Blackwood, a man of immense power and no conscience, making a simple business decision. The cost of hiring assassins and burying the evidence was less than the perceived cost of yielding to the Union. He had weighed the lives of 117 people against his own authority and found them wanting. He hadn't just defeated the strike. He had liquidated the assets, treating the human beings who worked for him as disposable components in his industrial machine. Julian Blackwood's public statements now seemed utterly grotesque. His talk of honoring the victims and preserving his family's legacy was an obscene continuation of the original cover-up. He wasn't just the grandson of a ruthless industrialist. He was the modern steward of a lie, using his wealth and influence to protect a fortune founded on mass murder. Eris realized her fight was not just with the ghost of Silas Blackwood, but with the living, breathing embodiment of his legacy. The investigation was no longer about the past. It was a direct confrontation with a present and a powerful adversary. Detective Corbin, now fully convinced of the conspiracy, began to apply legal pressure. He secured warrants for 80 years of Blackwood Coal and Iron's corporate records, specifically seeking any internal correspondence related to the 1928 strike. The Blackwood Energy legal team fought back, citing confidentiality and the immense passage of time. But the public tide was turning. News of the secret ledger and the geological findings had leaked, and the story of a tragic accident was being replaced by the horrifying narrative of a corporate-sponsored massacre. The Blackwood name, once a symbol of Appalachian industry, was becoming synonymous with atrocity. Eris, meanwhile, continued her work within the town, driven by a new urgency. She knew that while the circumstantial evidence was overwhelming, a modern court case against a figure like Julian Blackwood would require something more. They had the how and the why, but they lacked the final irrefutable proof, a direct link, a confession, an order given by Silas Blackwood himself. Without that, Julian could continue to deflect, to blame long-dead subordinates, to claim ignorance of his grandfather's specific actions. The conspiracy was proven, but the architect's identity was still shielded by time. She began to focus on the personal effects of the key players. In the mine manager's modest home, she found nothing. In the company barracks where the regular guards lived, there were only mundane remnants of daily life. The answer was not with the pawns. It had to be with the king. Where would Silas Blackwood have conducted the final, most sensitive operations of his plan? The answer was as obvious as it was tantalizingly out of reach. The main mine office, the very building his lawyers were fighting to keep sealed from the most invasive forensic analysis. The legal battle for the mine office raged for weeks, becoming a public spectacle. Julian Blackwood argued that a full forensic sweep would desecrate a historical structure, an argument dripping with irony. He was using the language of preservation to conceal a crime. For Eris, every day of delay was a risk, as the delicate documents and artifacts within could degrade with continued exposure to the open air. The office was the nerve center of the entire operation, the place where the order was likely given, and Blackwood was using all his power to keep its doors shut. What was he so desperate to hide? The team began to re-examine the town's layout, searching for any detail they might have missed. They analyzed the single road leading in and out of the hollow, confirming it could have been easily blockaded. They mapped the sight lines from the mine office, realizing it had a commanding view of the entire valley, including the church. From that vantage point, a commander could have overseen the entire operation, from the first shot fired to the final mountain-shattering detonation. Every new detail reinforced the theory of a centrally planned and executed military-style operation. Eris found herself returning again and again to the story of her great-grandfather's final walk. He was summoned to the mine office for a final negotiation. He had walked into the lion's den alone. What happened in that office? Was he the first to be killed? Was his murder the signal for the rest of the massacre to begin? His personal effects were never found, but Eris felt a certainty growing in her gut that the answer to his fate and the fate of the entire town lay within that single, heavily guarded building. The pressure on Julian Blackwood became unbearable. A coalition of historical societies and victims' descendants, organized by Eris, launched a public campaign demanding full access. The state governor, feeling the political heat, finally intervened, and the court sided with the investigation. The injunction was lifted. Detective Corbin's team was granted unrestricted access to the mine office. It felt like a monumental victory, a turning point in the long, silent war against the Blackwood legacy. As the forensic team prepared to breach the office's heavy steel door, a palpable tension settled over the entire site. They entered the office to find a scene as perfectly preserved as the rest of the town. A thick layer of dust covered everything, but underneath it was a snapshot of 1928. Papers sat on a large oak desk, a telephone rested in its cradle, and an empty chair was pushed back as if its occupant had just left. The room was the brain of Prosperity Creek, the place from which all power flowed. It felt colder than the rest of the town, heavy with the weight of the decisions that had been made within its walls. The initial search of the office revealed expected items, production schedules, geological maps, payroll ledgers for the official miners. It was all meticulously organized, the public face of a legitimate business operation. There was no overt evidence of the massacre, no signed confession left conveniently on the desk. For a moment, a wave of despair washed over Eris. Had Julian Blackwood's fight been a bluff? Was the office a dead end, a final frustrating red herring in a case that was still missing its most crucial piece of evidence? Then, a junior forensic technician noticed something odd about the wall behind the main desk. It was paneled in dark, heavy oak, but one section seemed different. The wood grain didn't perfectly align, and a faint, almost invisible seam ran along its edge. It was a detail so minor it could have been easily overlooked, a slight imperfection in an otherwise immaculate room. But in a crime scene, there are no imperfections, only clues. The technician ran a density scanner over the area, and the screen lit up, revealing a hollow space behind the wood. Hidden behind the false panel was not a secret compartment, but something far more significant. A large walk-in steel safe manufactured by the Canton Safe and Lock Company. It was a fortress of riveted steel, its combination dial frozen by 80 years of silent disuse. This was not a standard office safe for petty cash. It was a vault designed to protect the most valuable assets of the Blackwood Coal and Iron Company from fire, theft, or even a mine collapse. It was the one place in Prosperity Creek built to survive the very event Silas Blackwood had engineered. The discovery of the safe electrified the team. Why would such a formidable vault be hidden behind a secret panel? What secrets did it contain that needed to be protected not just by a lock, but by a layer of deliberate concealment? This had to be the place where Silas Blackwood kept the records he never wanted the world to see, the true accounting of his most ruthless business transaction. Julian Blackwood hadn't been trying to protect the office itself. He had been trying to protect the contents of this safe. The team brought in a specialist, an elderly safecracker, who worked with law enforcement on historical cases. For hours he worked with delicate instruments and a stethoscope, listening to the faint clicks of the tumblers, gears that had not turned since 1928. The air in the small office was thick with anticipation. Eris watched, her heart pounding, feeling that she was on the precipice of the final terrible truth. This safe was a time capsule within a time capsule, a locked box holding the key to the entire conspiracy. With a final satisfying thud, the heavy bolt mechanism disengaged. The specialist and two officers strained to pull the massive steel door open. It groaned on its hinges, the sound echoing through the silent town like a sigh of release. As the door swung wide, it revealed not stacks of cash or gold, but a collection of neatly organized leather-bound ledgers and several strange, cylindrical cardboard tubes. The mundane appearance of the contents belied their immense significance. They were the hidden heart of the Blackwood Empire. Eris, wearing archival gloves, reached in and carefully lifted the topmost ledger. Its cover was embossed with simple gold lettering, SB Private Accounts, 1928. She opened it, and the first page confirmed her darkest suspicions. It wasn't a financial ledger in the traditional sense. It was a logbook with dated entries written in a precise, authoritative hand. The entries detailed the strike, the hiring of the consultants, and the strategic acquisition of the dynamite. It was Silas Blackwood's personal diary of a massacre. The logbook was a confession written with the cold detachment of a corporate report. It detailed the problem of the Union, the solution proposed, and the cost analysis of its execution. Silas Blackwood had documented his own atrocity with the same meticulous care he applied to his coal production schedules. He saw no moral distinction. To him, eliminating the Union and its supporters was simply the most efficient resolution to a labor dispute, a necessary action to protect his assets and ensure future profitability. The arrogance was breathtaking, but as damning as the ledger was, it was the cardboard tubes that would ultimately seal the fate of the Blackwood legacy. Eris carefully opened one and slid out its contents. It was a wax cylinder, the type used in early dictaphone recording machines. A small typewritten label was pasted onto its side. It read, E. Thorne, Final Negotiation, October 28, 1928. She realized with a jolt of horror that she was holding her great-grandfather's last words, and perhaps the voice of his killer. The team located a vintage Edison phonograph in the corner of the office, a machine clearly used for dictation. With extreme care, the forensic audio expert placed the delicate wax cylinder onto the machine's spindle. The technology was primitive, but its potential was monumental. If the recording had survived, it would be the closest thing to a living witness, a voice from the grave that could speak across 80 years of silence. It was a direct link to the events in that room on that final terrible night. The existence of this hidden safe and its contents completely obliterated Julian Blackwood's narrative of ignorance. It was inconceivable that he did not know of its existence. Such a critical piece of family and corporate history, a secret vault in the founder's office, would have been a legacy passed down from father to son, a skeleton in the closet that each generation was tasked with keeping hidden. His desperate legal battle to block access to the office was now cast in a new, sinister light. He wasn't protecting history. He was actively perpetuating a cover-up. The investigation had reached its critical juncture. They had methodically dismantled the official story. proving the massacre and the engineered landslide through modern forensic science. They had uncovered overwhelming circumstantial evidence through payroll ledgers and ballistics, painting a clear picture of a corporate-sponsored death squad. Now, with the discovery of Silas Blackwood's private logbook, they had a written confession. The entire case had been built, piece by damning piece, from the silent evidence left behind. Eris looked from the ledger to the wax cylinder, her hands trembling slightly. They had reconstructed the timeline of the crime with near-perfect clarity, exposing the lie that had stood for generations. The motive was clear, the method was clear, and the culprits were no longer nameless phantoms. The entire conspiracy was laid bare, a testament to the dogged pursuit of forensic truth. The fortress of lies built by the Blackwood dynasty was about to be brought down by the very secrets it was designed to protect. They had followed the evidence from the bodies in the church to the dynamite residue in the mountain, from the bullet casings on the floor to the secret ledgers in the office. Each discovery had been a hammer blow against the wall of deception. Now they stood on the verge of hearing the final, irrefutable proof from the mouth of the monster himself. The question was no longer whether they could prove what happened to Prosperity Creek. The only question that remained was what terrible truth was etched into the grooves of that fragile wax cylinder. The air in the mine office was thick with the dust of 80 years and the electric tension of a verdict about to be read. The forensic audio expert, a man accustomed to coaxing whispers from damaged cassette tapes and digital files, handled the wax cylinder with the reverence of a priest handling a sacred relic. He placed it onto the spindle of the antique Edison phonograph, its brass horn gleaming under the harsh, portable lights. Every person in the small room, Eris, Detective Corbin, and a handful of forensic technicians, held their breath. This was not merely evidence, it was a séance, an attempt to channel a voice from a world of silence and listen to the final moments of a ghost. The machine was a bridge across time, and they were about to cross it. With a final, delicate adjustment, the expert lowered the stylus into the grooves. For a heart-stopping moment, there was only the sound of the hand-cranked motor turning, followed by a faint hiss and a series of loud pops and crackles. The sound of a needle navigating the scars of time. The static was a physical barrier, a sound wall that had protected the secret for decades. Eris gripped the edge of the oak desk, her knuckles white. She had spent her life studying the aftermath, the cold historical record. Now she was about to become an ear witness to the cause, to hear the voices that the mountain had been forced to swallow in a single, violent gulp. Then, through the static, a voice emerged, impossibly clear and resonant. It was strong, laced with the proud, defiant cadence of the Appalachian hills, and utterly devoid of fear. Eris knew with a certainty that was both chilling and profoundly moving that she was hearing the voice of her great-grandfather, Elias Thorne. He was not pleading or negotiating. He was delivering a final, unbending statement of principle. He spoke of the miners' dignity, of their right to a life free from debt and the constant threat of a collapsed tunnel. He was not a man begging for his life. He was a leader speaking for the lives of his 117 constituents, his voice a testament to their unified struggle. Another voice answered, and the contrast was immediate and jarring. It was smooth, educated, and utterly devoid of warmth or empathy. It was the voice of Silas Blackwood, a sound as cold and sharp as chipped slate. He spoke with the calm, unassailable authority of a man who owned the very air his counterpart was breathing. There was no anger in his tone, only a chillingly pragmatic finality, the sound of a butcher calmly explaining the necessity of his work. He was not debating Elias. He was informing him of a decision that had already been made, a business transaction that was already finalized. The power dynamic was absolute, a conversation between a king and a condemned man. The recording laid the entire negotiation bare. It was a monstrous charade, a final cruel piece of theater. Silas Blackwood offered Elias a single personal lifeline: publicly renounce the Union, discredit the strike, and leave the valley with his family alive and with a generous severance. It was a test of his soul, a final attempt to break the one man he could not buy or intimidate. Blackwood wasn't trying to end the strike. He was trying to shatter its symbol, to prove that every man, even the most righteous, had a price. The offer was not an act of mercy, but an act of ultimate psychological cruelty, designed to isolate and destroy him from within. Elias Thorne's reply was his final testament, the words that would define his legacy. He refused without a moment of hesitation. "My life is not my own to sell, Mr. Blackwood," his voice rang out from the brass horn, clear and unwavering. "It belongs to the men and women who have placed their trust in me. We are a community, not a column on your ledger. My fate is with my people, here, in this valley." In that single powerful declaration, he sealed his own fate and immortalized his commitment. He chose solidarity over survival, a decision that transformed him from a labor organizer into a martyr, his final words an act of unbreakable defiance against an absolute tyrant. A brief, chilling silence followed Elias's refusal. Then Silas Blackwood's voice returned, no longer addressing Thorne, but a third, previously unheard man in the room. The tone shifted from cold negotiation to direct command. "Mr. Harris," he said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, "the disease has refused the cure. We will proceed with the full amputation." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. "Their union is a pestilence. We will cut it out, burn the body, and tell the world they died of natural causes. The men at the church have their orders. You have yours. Trigger the charges at dawn. God will forgive a necessary act, especially when there is no one left to testify against it." The final sound on the recording was not a word. Following Blackwood's order, there was the sharp scrape of a chair being pushed back on a wooden floor, a single, deafeningly loud gunshot, and then an abrupt final silence. The hiss of the needle on the empty wax groove was the only sound that remained. Elias Thorne had been executed in that very office, his murder the opening salvo of the larger massacre. The recording was not just a confession to a conspiracy. It was the live broadcast of an assassination, the irrefutable, audible proof that had been locked in darkness for 80 years. It was the trophy, the smoking gun, the ghost's own testimony. The silence in the office was now absolute, broken only by a single ragged sob from Aris. The academic detachment she had clung to for so long shattered completely, washed away by a wave of profound, ancestral grief. She was not just a historian hearing a primary source, she was a great-granddaughter hearing the murder of her kin. The recording had given her the truth, but it had also given her the full, unvarnished horror of his final, lonely moments. Detective Corbin placed a steadying hand on her shoulder, his own face a grim mask of disbelief and cold fury. They had found it. They had the monster's voice, his motive, and his method, all etched into a cylinder of wax. The legal and public fallout was immediate and explosive. The wax cylinder was authenticated by 3 separate forensic labs, its contents deemed undeniable. Julian Blackwood, still attempting to control the narrative through press releases about his shock and sorrow, was summoned to a state senate hearing, believing his lawyers could contain the damage. He walked into the chamber, a respected philanthropist, the dignified leader of a modern energy giant. He would leave it as the disgraced heir to a legacy of mass murder, his carefully constructed world about to be publicly dismantled before a live television audience. Detective Corbin, acting as the lead witness for the state, did not begin with charts or geological surveys. He began by placing a modern digital player on the witness table. He looked directly at Julian Blackwood, whose face was a mask of calm composure. "Mr. Blackwood," Corbin began, his voice steady and clear, You have claimed to have no knowledge of the specific events of October 1928. You have painted your grandfather as a man of his time, perhaps ruthless, but not a murderer. We have found a piece of history that tells a different story, a story in his own words. He pressed play, and the chilling voice of Silas Blackwood filled the silent, cavernous hearing room. The effect was devastating. The press corps erupted. Senators sat in stunned silence. But all eyes were on Julian Blackwood as his grandfather's voice detailed the cold-blooded plan to excise this cancerous growth. Julian's composure finally irrevocably shattered. The mask of genteel philanthropy melted away, revealing the raw, cornered fury of a man whose entire identity had been built upon a lie. His face paled, then flushed with a rage born of exposure. The recording was not just an indictment of his grandfather, it was an indictment of the 80 years of silent familial complicity that followed. The secret of the safe and its contents was a poison passed down from one generation to the next. Julian Blackwood was arrested as he tried to leave the hearing, not for the murders his grandfather committed, but for modern, prosecutable crimes, felony obstruction of justice perjury, and conspiracy to conceal evidence in a mass homicide investigation. Investigators had found internal family documents passed from Julian's father to him that explicitly referenced the Prosperity Creek liability and the founder's vault, proving he had known about the safe and its damning contents all along. His desperate legal fight to keep the office sealed was now recast as a criminal act, a conscious effort to perpetuate the cover-up his grandfather had begun. The trial was a formality, the evidence was overwhelming, the public outrage absolute. Julian Blackwood, the titan of industry, was convicted and sentenced to prison, his name forever linked not with philanthropy, but with one of the most monstrous corporate crimes in American history. Blackwood Energy, unable to survive the moral and financial implosion, was broken up and sold for parts, its assets liquidated. The empire built on the graves of 117 people had finally crumbled, brought down by the echoes of a voice it had tried so desperately to silence. Justice, delayed for 80 years, had finally arrived with the crushing force of a landslide. In the valley of Prosperity Creek, a different kind of work began. The bodies of the 117 victims were carefully, reverently exhumed from the church and the surrounding grounds. The state, in an act of restorative justice, declared the entire hollow a protected historical site and cemetery. The remains were identified, and for the first time, descendants had a grave to visit, a place to mourn their lost relatives not as victims of a random accident, but as casualties in a fight for human dignity. The process was somber, a final heartbreaking accounting of the true cost of Silas Blackwood's greed. A new memorial was erected at the entrance to the hollow, replacing the old, dishonest plaque that spoke of a tragic landslide. The new monument was carved from the same gray granite of the surrounding mountains, but it bore a new inscription. It listed the names of all 117 men, women, and children. Below the names, the simple, powerful truth was finally etched in stone for all time. Murdered on October 28, 1928, by the Blackwood Coal and Iron Company for the crime of demanding a better life. May their memory be a testament to the enduring power of truth. Eris Thorne stood before the new monument on the day of its dedication, a crisp autumn afternoon, much like the one 80 years prior. She traced the name of her great-grandfather, Elias Thorne, feeling the cold stone beneath her fingertips. Her academic quest had become a personal crusade, and the victory was profound, yet deeply bittersweet. She had reclaimed her family's history from the lies of the powerful, but the cost, measured in generations of unaddressed grief, was immense. She had given the dead their story back, and in doing so had found a measure of peace for the living. The unearthed town of Prosperity Creek was left as it was found, a silent, preserved testament to the moment its life was extinguished. It became a museum of an atrocity, a place where future generations could walk the quiet streets and understand the brutal realities of the past. The church doors remained open, a permanent invitation to bear witness to the horror and the heroism that had transpired within its walls. The town was no longer a buried secret, but a permanent, unignorable lesson, a scar on the landscape that would never be allowed to fully heal over. Aris looked out over the hollow, the fall colors blazing on the hillsides. The silence of the valley was different now. It was no longer the heavy, oppressive silence of a buried crime, but a peaceful, reverent silence of a place of remembrance. The ghosts of Prosperity Creek had not been exorcised, they had been vindicated. Their long, 80-year vigil in the dark was over. Their story was now part of the American tapestry, a brutal but necessary reminder of the cost of unchecked power and the courage of those who dared to stand against it. The resolution was absolute, a definitive end to a mystery that had spanned nearly a century. The guilty had been punished, the victims honored, and the historical record corrected with indelible ink. The emotional wounds for the descendants would remain, but they were now clean wounds, free of the poison of deception and unanswered questions. The truth had not brought the dead back to life, but it had granted them a form of immortality, ensuring they would never be forgotten or misunderstood again. For Aris, the journey was complete. She had started by searching for the story of a single man and had ended by uncovering the soul of an entire community. She had proven that no power, no fortune, and no amount of time could truly bury a monstrous act. The legacy of Prosperity Creek was no longer one of tragedy, but of resilience, the resilience of a community that stood together in life, and whose story, unearthed from the darkness, stood as a beacon of justice in death. The case of the vanished town served as a powerful, enduring lesson. It demonstrated that history is not a static text, but a living entity, constantly being re-examined and rewritten. It showed that justice has no statute of limitations, and that truth, no matter how deep it is buried, retains a geological force of its own. Given enough time and a single determined voice to ask the right questions, it will eventually push its way to the surface, breaking through the rock and lies to finally reach the light.